Hello, everybody, and welcome to this edition of V Radio. Tonight we have a great show lined up with Roger Stahl from the film and book Militainment Incorporated. Just a couple of heads up, we actually have a lot of great shows lined up in the next 4 days. Been putting up individual threads about them on the Zeitgeist Movement forums. I've also posted about them on Facebook, but you can look forward to what we have lined up is on Monday I have Frank Dorrell, who's one of the publishers behind the book Addicted to War. We also have the Sam Bozzo, the filmmaker from the film World Water Wars, Blue Gold World Water Wars, great documentary about the state of our water supply. That was narrated by, I think it was McDowell? No, I'm going to say that name wrong, but in any case, he was in Star Trek, a couple of other films, but not the person who's coming on, obviously, but having his voice narrate a film that was activist-oriented was interesting. I'm also going to have the Energy Action Coalition, and in addition to that, I just got word that it looks like I'll be having the filmmaker from The Future of Food will be on in a very soon episode, hopefully sometime this next week. So we've got an exciting week lined up. I'm also, as always, still struggling for the donation front. Anybody who can help me out would be highly appreciated. I'm still trying to squeeze together some money. You're going to be getting more of the Zeitgeist TV stuff out of me, but I have a suspicion that something I am installing when I get ready to run Zeitgeist TV is the cause of the blue screen of death problem that I've been having. Which is the reason that I've been having trouble is that I've been getting requests that people want more guests and less book reading, so I've been working on trying to get more guests, but it would be very embarrassing to have to end a show because of a blue screen of death. But all of that said, I'm going to go ahead and introduce my co-host tonight and our guest. I'm going to start with my co-host who hates introducing himself, so he's probably just going to say, "Hi, I'm Chibi." So Chibi, introduce yourself.
Oh, hi, I guess I got to do it now.
Yeah. Most of my listeners have been listening for a long time, obviously know who Chibi is. And also, as I said earlier, Mr. Stahl, please introduce yourself to the audience.
Hi, my name is Roger Stahl. I'm an associate professor at the University of Georgia, and I study rhetoric and media studies for the most part. And I appreciate you having me on your show, First Things First.
Mm-hmm.
But you mentioned, I suppose, why I'm here. I made a film in 2007 called Militainment, Inc., which was sort of a critical look at the military entertainment complex, for lack of a better term, the military Nintendo complex, as it has been called, or just simply Militainment. And then close on the heels of that project was a more academically oriented book by the same name and on similar subjects, but going into more of an esoteric look at the history of this relationship between the military and the entertainment industries.
And that's, I have to say, for those of you who want to see his film, I do have a link to it on must-see TV on vradio.org, v-radio.org. But there is a much better version of it if you get to see the full version, and I have to say it was definitely worth it. So be sure to check out his film and his book. I thought I had a link to the book on my show. I don't know if that came up or not. The Amazon thing doesn't always work right, but I'd actually prefer, though, if you want to give them, is there like a better way they can get your book so we don't have to cut Amazon in?
Well, I don't know. They're selling it almost at every retail bookseller that major one that I can think of. So if you can avoid Amazon, that's pretty easy to do, I think. Okay,
excellent. Yeah, I know some of these activist books, they don't get as much coverage as they really deserve, so that's why I was curious. But that being said, I'm actually looking forward to this. I went back and rewatched the film in its full version that you gave me, and it actually, Chibi, you were one of the people who recommended it to me earlier. The first thing, and I just, some of the parts, like I actually just re-went over, and they're really hilarious, just the various ways that the media spins things, and how one is obviously in bed with the other when it comes to this sort of stuff. Now, I got to ask you, do you think, where do you think this comes from? Do you think it's, like military-industrial complex, like, influence on the media? Like, are there corporations that are buying interest in the media? Or is it just the media thinking to themselves, oh, well, we can make a lot of money if we cover this war thing, so let's do it?
Well, It's all of those things. Increasingly, I think the entertainment industries and also tech enterprises are finding that war sells, and that if they can strike deals with the military, then they can take that aspect of war that is very exciting, very kind of, the aspect that sells quite well and makes for good TV and also good video games, good toys, and a number of other things. And if they can strike the right deal, then it's a win-win situation for media companies and the military. But unfortunately, there's some hidden costs behind the scenes, especially in terms of the citizen and what kind of news we are getting, what sorts of representations of war in the military we are getting as citizens. So, to answer your question, I think if we were looking for a center, it's hard to find one. The best way to look at the phenomenon of militainment or the military-industrial complex is to look at it systemically and understand that there's a government element, there are public relations elements, there are corporate elements and profit motives involved, and they have formed a sort of mutually self-reinforcing complex of interests. But for the most part, when we look at the last 50 years or something like that, we see an increasing prevalence of media in everyday U.S. citizens' lives, an increasing prevalence of the screen, an increasing prevalence of television, of course, the internet at the end of the century. And an increasing, I think, corporate interest and influence as well. So, I probably argue that after World War II, the locus, and I think Eisenhower said this really well, the locus of power moved from, government institutions that, we would associate with traditional propaganda to corporate institutions, which, most of the main media outlets that we can name serve as, mouthpieces to these big corporate institutions. So if you were looking for like a center of power, an organizing principle, I would probably argue that it's the increasing corporatization of the state, a corporate-driven military, corporate-driven propaganda system, corporatism almost on every front.
And that's, that's basically something we talk about here on the show all the time because, the fact that we, in the Zeitgeist movement, we deal with issues that have to do with the profit structure and the capitalist structure of things and how when you have a profit motive in something, inevitably it's going to get corrupted. And I feel that, it's with the media particularly, you see this a lot. Films such as Outfoxed, Rupert Murdoch's War on Journalism, Orwell rolls in his great, both really good documentaries on this subject, and then obviously we have Militainment. And have you seen those other two films?
Yeah, I have actually seen both of them. Yeah. They're good.
So was there anything in particular you would say, like, I mean, did you see those films before you did your film? Do they have any impact on anything you were deciding to do?
As I was making the film, those came out. I think both of those are around 2004. And so sort of the term of this film had been, taking root a little bit during that period, and I had to put it on hold for a while. But I was collecting all this stuff from, the build-up to the Iraq invasion and the immediate aftermath, and then had to sort of put it on the shelf for a while. So those, that wave of critical documentaries definitely at the time informed how I was thinking about things, and I hope that I contributed to that conversation with the humble and meager offering that I put together in Militainment, Inc.
Yeah, I have to say, honestly, it was really well done, and overall, especially your use of the actual clips, I think it's a reason why I believe people should probably read the book and watch the film at the same time. And a lot of it actually also reminded me of a book that I've read on my show in the past, written at least in part by a friend of mine, Senator Mike Gravel, you may remember him from the previous presidential debates, but he wrote a book called The Kingmakers, and it talked a lot about the power of the media and how they spun things. And I could hear his words in the back of my head when you were doing that little expose on the statue of Saddam that was coming down. And he described in detail what was actually going on the ground in his book, and he was talking about how it really wasn't that many people, and they just kept moving that camera angle to make it look like there was this giant crowd of people taking down this statue when most people in Iraq really didn't care. And how they structured it to be exactly that instant history that you talk about in your film. That it really wasn't that big a deal. I mean, it was just the amount of the vandalism. I don't really think most of those people really cared too much about it. And it's not to say that people didn't dislike Saddam. They did, but it's just we kind of turned it into this amazing thing, and compared it to toppling the Berlin Wall and, maybe taking down statues or Nazi symbols during World War II. It was really an attempt to try to make a big tent thing, and that's why they said it was a psyop, or the people involved with military intelligence were involved. There was some kind of psychological impact that they were looking for. And it's now every time I see that thing come down on television, I just can't help but laugh because of how much BS is involved. It's really troubling to me that people watch this stuff and they believe it. And it's actually. Have you heard any further developments on that part of the story, or anything you want to comment on that?
Well, I don't think it has developed further, and I think it sort of fell off the radar, and I suppose merited no further comment among the folks who orchestrated that event. But in one sense, it's the closest that war came to constructing a moment of what we would recognize as classic propaganda. But also, this wasn't just, a propaganda film or a poster or something like that. This is a real-time event that, was broadcast all over the world live. And, the fact that, you bring up that it was called in some of the military documents a psychological operations event. Mm-hmm. And that's battlefield terminology for, in essence, a weapons system. Psychological operations is meant to operate in the same way as a weapon would on the battlefield. Right. Which is interesting because, they didn't call it propaganda. They didn't call it, a pseudo event or, construction for the home front audience. They were calling it a psychological operation, which kind of tells us that very little distinction is being made, at least in terms of that event, between the Iraqi public, the government that was still holding on by a thread, the Iraqi government that was operating at that time in Iraq, and that was the object of that statue event, in as much as the home front audience back in the United States was an object of that, and also, probably Europe as well. So, you have these multiple fractured audiences. One is battlefield, one is home front, one is maybe a kind of a tertiary European audience. And, this event comes together and speaks to these multiple audiences at the same time in a language that is very much sort of weaponized. And I think it kind of speaks to the fact that we're not being so much propagandized as a home front audience anymore, but, and a lot of military literature reflects this. But the home front is itself considered a battlefield theater of operations, such that, a psychological operation operates in much the same way with some of the same desired effects on the battlefield as it does here on this battlefield on this coast right. Across the Atlantic, which, tells us something about how the military has changed its regard for the citizen in the United States, I think.
Absolutely. Now, Chibi, did you want to pipe in here with anything? Any observations that you had about what we're talking about?
Yeah, well, when you talk about the psychological part of the warfare, I was wondering, have you read Naomi Klein's book, The Shock Doctrine? And she talks a lot about, like, Donald Rumsfeld and the Chicago Boys in a lot of different things that might have, I guess, added to that effect, where they really try and psychologically have an impact with war and economics combined.
Yeah, I know. I'm familiar with the thesis, and I haven't read the book straight through, but I've read, a number of excerpts and essays in various places. But yeah, she's very much tuned into the sort of immaterial aspect of war, and the fact that it's not only immaterial, but it works on an economic plane as well. That to be a profound psychological shift for these, more, I guess, material and kinetic forms of control to move in. So, that could be either shock and awe in Baghdad, or it could be a tsunami in the Indian Ocean.
Right.
And that's, it's interesting, when we were talking about shock and awe, and, watching those film clips really took me back to, around that time, and, I remember how different I was back then, somebody who actually believed at least the majority of what I saw in the news, and it really took me to a different time in my life when I was really under the effects of that. And we talked about this, off the air before the show, but I had another moment, and we can get into this part of the topic too, is like when you militarize your children. I was watching this really old film, because it's something I've kind of made a habit of doing now, as I go back and I watch the films that I used to watch when I was a child or a teenager. You really learn a lot about yourself when you go back and watch that stuff, because you start to think about, wow, this is why I'm attracted to this kind of girl, and this is why I'm attracted to, these kinds of situations, and this is why I am this kind of person, You learn a lot just by going back and watching the stuff that you used to watch as a kid. Well, I watched this old film called The Boy Who Could Fly, something I used to watch when I was a really young, I would probably say preteen, and one of the characters in the film was the main character is like this young girl, but her younger brother is totally plugged into the G.I. Joe stuff. He wears camouflage all the time. He's got all these G.I. Joe characters. I could even recognize some of them, all their action figures, and his big wheel, those plastic tricycles people used to ride around. I miss my big wheel. Was of course G.I. Joe, or military oriented, and I remember that because I used to be like that. I wasn't as extreme. I mean, I went with Transformers more honestly, and Transformers I wouldn't say makes you militant, although also we pointed out, and we'll probably end up talking about this as well, as the latest Transformers films though are total commercials for the military. But but it occurred to me, back when you were a kid, I remember being subject to all that stuff, and because of it, I wanted to join the military, is what I thought I wanted to do with my life. I thought I wanted to be a fighter pilot, and I still see it every now and then, like you talked about the techno-fetishism, and you're really, the notion that, technology, particularly, like in this case, military technology, can become an object of beauty, and I still catch myself every now and then. I live not far from Selfridge Air Force Base, and a plane will fly over, and I'll be like, oh, it's an A-10 Warthog, or, that's an F-16, and I'll find my reaction to that military equipment being positive, which is in direct contradiction to my current, way of thinking. That's when you know that there's a certain degree of conditioning involved, and you don't think about it, because it hits you in the subconscious. It's why now I'm so scared of the stuff my kids watch. I'm really careful about it. I always watch all the the children's shows that they're watching, and I screen them and stuff, just because I don't. And it's not because I want them to be brainwashed towards one group or another. It's because I want them to be free of that stuff. And I think people don't really realize, just how much work they really put into getting you, it's as a kid. And that, of course, linked to it reminded me of the same stuff that I remember learning about fast food in another documentary. I can't remember the name of it, but it was about fast food and how they market it to kids, and how they catch you at that young age and just get you indoctrinated into thinking about it. And, you're like, wow, you just have no idea, that this stuff has such an impact on you until you literally go back and watch it. And, we talked about video games and the directions that they're taking, and, You know, I mean, like, so go ahead and, like, share with me. I know you've talked about there have been further developments in those things. But if you want to expound on the things I'm just talking about that, go ahead.
Well, I grew up in the age of, I was in puberty right as Top Gun came out. So I came out of that theater, with all guns blazing. And it was sort of, that was such a success, that film, that it spawned all these other, Iron Eagle and Iron Eagle 2 and all these films that were aimed directly at my age group. And my friends and I all were going to be fighter pilots. And you mentioned, before, that we're the same age, and I can see this being replicated all over the place. And I'm not sure if there's anything necessarily wrong with viewing military technology as something beautiful and awe-inspiring and terrifying. And that when this is some of the most advanced technology on Earth. Of course, it makes a difference if, when that plane flies overhead, you imagine the village next to you being bombed or not.
Right.
But certainly, we are not conditioned in that way in the United States. Somebody told me the other day that, some kind of a Black Hawk helicopter flew over, and he said, that's just conditioning.
Right.
That they just fly them around to condition us to the coming, militarized martial law state or something like that. I mean, I'm not saying that's necessarily the case or that's what's happening. I live next to an airport, and they refuel as they come through, and so I see all manner of things like that. But certainly we have a different relationship to military technology here because the bombs aren't falling in our backyard.
Yes.
And that seems like a really stupid, obvious comment, but it's an essential difference, I suppose. But you asked about kids. It's sort of been a long-standing theme in a lot of critical literature going all the way back to World War I, where something horrible will happen, like World War I, and someone will come along and write a book about it and try to figure out exactly how the population was socialized into sending wave after wave of young men to die, in no man's land between the trenches, and how people cheered for it, the spirit of 1914, and how nations just erupted with parades when war was declared. How did that happen? And a lot of people will point to this sort of early socialization of, this is when waves and waves of toy soldiers were coming out of Europe.
Right.
And the mechanization of war and mass conscription and everything depends on the mechanization of a kind of large-scale socialization process. And that's true up to the current day, too, in ways that, as you say, we are not necessarily conscious of until we go back and watch these films later.
Right.
And I think probably the best example of that, there's a really wonderful book out there by Neil SHAHEEN called Real Bad Arabs. And it's essentially a look at the last 100 years of film, or even back further than that. And his task was to find one positive depiction of an Arab character. And he can't find one. He can't find a positive depiction of an Arab character. And, having read that, just reading that book, I, of course, combed my memory in trying to find one. This is a kind of like subterranean, unconscious socialization process that no matter who you are, young or old, you grew up with in the United States and probably in Great Britain too, because of our historical relationship to the natural resources in that area and the fact that, those resources demanded that imperial powers move in, and a kind of complex of propaganda had to support that as well. Right. And that's why we get this history of representation. So yeah, I think it's a really interesting exercise to look back and try to understand, where, and sometimes we can't do it unless someone else draws our attention to it, like Neil SHAHEEN. But where our conceptions of what war is like come from, because very few of us have experienced it directly, and maybe a few more have experienced it indirectly through family members and whatnot. But this is certainly the case in the United States. One more thing before
Sure.
the next question. The issue of children is kind of an interesting one, and when people broach the question of the military entertainment complex, automatically, the issue of the socialization of children comes up, and usually in the form of, do war films make kids violent, and will they turn into psychopaths and commit Columbine-type acts later in life? And it's a good question. Or do video games make kids violent, or something like that? And that's a long-standing debate and a long-standing question. And I'm not a psychologist, so I'm not running laboratory studies, but many of those have been done, and fairly with consistent outcomes. People learn behaviors and whatnot. But there's still a lot of debate. But I think the really interesting thing recently is that many of these things that in the past we would have relegated to the socialization of adolescents and children are now sort of entering into adult life. So that people who have actual political power, people who can vote, people that actually make the decisions, are, it's not just Iron Eagle aimed at the 12-year-old, it's a kind of new-fangled Iron Eagle or Top Gun that is aimed at the 34-year-old. And I think this is probably most apparent in the realm of video games, where the median age of the gamer has crept up, and it's about early 30s, 32, 33 now. So it's hitting right in the middle of the spectrum, and right in the middle of those who can actually affect the world through our system of representation and other ways. So suddenly we're in a place where we're not just worried about our kids and how violent they are, but we're worried about the quality of the citizen. Can we make decisions about other people's lives halfway around the planet, or are we sort of being entertained while following the script that Donald Rumsfeld has written for us? So I think this is a new question that has arisen since the first Gulf War, since the early 90s.
That's it's interesting. You talked about the way that Arabs are depicted, and I see a lot of this also in religion, in the extreme Christian right. It's like they're trying to pave the way for a new crusade mentality, and ironically, the ones that came to my mind, the only positive depictions of Arabs that I can think of, one of them was in Kingdom of Heaven. The Arabs were actually, depicted in a way that I feel was at least reasonable, and they were trying to point out that, there were humans on both sides. And then the other depiction was not an American film; it's a European film called Arn the Templar. And in that film, Saladin is, basically depicted the way that historically he's supposed to be depicted, which is that he was kind of he was a well-mannered man, that he was chivalrous, and that in fact what most people do not know historically is that Saladin actually created a lot of what are later referred to as the virtues of knighthood that European knights followed, supposedly followed. Very rarely did they actually follow them, but that a lot of notions of chivalry actually came from Saladin, an Arabic knight or its equivalent. But you don't hear about that stuff, And I remember in Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves, next to Kevin Costner, we have the black man, Morgan Freeman, who's being depicted as a Arab. And that character was pretty good. But I see what you're talking about, and in most cases, it is kind of like that, and especially now, and it actually frightens me because I see the way that some of these people talk about Islam, and I'm not a fan of any religion, but I'm really not a fan of any kind of theocracy or any kind of blending religion with, the affairs of state. I think it's a terrible idea. But as far as the way that I do feel, however, that they do use religion in their own way to justify things. Like when you take Sarah Palin saying that the war in Iraq is God's war. I'm still stunned that she said that. I thought we were done with that kind of craziness when George Bush was gone, but and then him saying God told him to invade Iraq or whatever, and and of course that ends up being part of it too. Like you quoted that in your movie. We talked about this actually, and I still chuckle when I think about it. That clip from the 700 Club journalist who said that he had this amazing religious experience when they were attacking Iraq, and that he came away that Jesus had told him that Jesus is now the Lord of Iraq. And I was like, wow. I mean, really? Are you serious? But it was, as you pointed out, there was a different spin. But, and I don't want to get too much on the religion tangent, but it seems that they really find ways to hit you, in your own value system. And they find ways to make what they're doing right or correct or justified. And I don't think that they leave religion out of that. I don't think that they leave, anything out of it that they can use as their own tool. And when you talked about Top Gun, there's another interesting thing that came out of it. Is that you don't necessarily, you watch these films and you get this really romanticized idea about things. And, it's like, for example, the F-14 Tomcat, I got this amazing idea that it was just this, wonderful plane. It was so great. I went to an air show once and I watched that thing and I'm like, man, this thing is a slug. I mean, they made a movie about this plane, but you watch it, you watch this movie and you think this plane is great, but, then I found out the reality of it is that the F-14 is, like I said, it's a slug. It's not very maneuverable. The only reason it's good at anything is because it can link up to an AWACS and shoot you with a missile from a really long distance, and as a result, it's an effective missile platform. But as far as a dogfighter, it's a piece of junk. But you watch these movies, and you get these romanticized notions about what you're gonna get out of it if you join the military. There was another film. Oh, I think it was No End in Sight, but I could be wrong. But it had this, this young boy who was joining the military, and the recruiters, of course, capitalize on all this stuff. So, he's got it in his head that he wants to be a helicopter pilot, and he wants to pilot the new stealth helicopter. And it's pretty obvious that the kid was not very intelligent and that they were taking advantage of him. And the reality is he was going to end up, going in there, and he's probably going to end up as a clerk or something. I'm not trying to be mean, but the reason he wants to join the military is he's seeing these movies about, military stuff, and therefore he gets, fascinated by it, but he's probably not going anywhere. It's so sad to see, people's lives taken over by it. And I have met ex-military people who are fine, but I've also met a lot of them that have a really, like when we talk about how they dehumanize other people, you get this attitude that, if you've never been in the military, it's almost like they treat you like you're subhuman, like you're not actually a person or a man or whatever. I mean, do you want to comment on that?
Well, they're getting, increasingly sophisticated with those means of both kind of desensitizing soldiers to the realities of, where the bullets and the bombs land, and also creating group cohesion and sort of manufacturing the perfect weapon system out of human bodies. This is kind of this is a complex question, I think, because at least for me, the military is a valuable thing. That we have a strong defense in place. I'm not saying the kind of defense that requires half of the federal budget or anything like that, what we have now, but a reasonable defense in place. That seems to me a valuable thing. So recruitment is a valuable thing. Manufacturing soldiers, even though it has some horrific fallout to some degree in terms of people's individual lives sometimes. It seems to be a valuable thing to a degree. So I can't say categorically come out against recruitment or something like that. There's all kinds of problems and economic disparities in the way that recruitment is handled. frankly, you know, it would be, I think, the best possible solution would be a universal conscription. You know, having everybody serve 2 years in the military. You know, that would prevent these kind of spurious wars where rich people send poor people to battle at a moment's notice and for no good reason, except to, you know,
that's actually something. Chuck Fresco said something very similar to that. He said he thinks that war would slow down quite a bit if you made sure that absolutely everybody, as soon as we have a war, gets conscripted, and that there's nobody who makes any profit off of it, that he doesn't think that war would really go too far, because you wouldn't be able to sit around on your yacht collecting your profits and thinking to yourself, well, it's just some welfare moms losing their kids. I don't care about that, you know.
Yeah. Well, I mean,
I'm sorry, what was that, Chini?
I said, what would that mean for pacifism, though? I guess there wouldn't be any place in society for those then. You know, everybody fight.
Well, I mean, that would, it's possible there could be a conscientious objector status as there was in Vietnam. But yeah, that would be a definite casualty of universal conscription. Something that you mentioned, Neil, you know, reminds me of Noam Chomsky, and he really has an elegant way of putting it, which is, you know, that war, and Noam Chomsky really does almost always analyze things in economic terms, but war is a transfer of wealth. It's a transfer of wealth in the taking of resources, which is the obvious one. But it's a transfer of wealth in terms of, you know, the bodies used, which are usually from the lower socioeconomic class. And it's a transfer of wealth in terms of taxes. You take, you know, the income tax or, you know, federal taxes of all kinds, and extract them from the citizenry while, you know, feeding them a line about what, you know, the war is about. And you apply that to a military that is essentially being used to perform a hostile takeover overseas of some territory or some set of resources or some strategic position. So yeah, transfer of wealth all the way around.
You know, the tax on military, though, doesn't really come out of, say, an income tax or anything like that. It's nothing you see directly. It's inflation down the road that everybody, I mean, everybody does pay for it, but it's not like the money you give into taxes this year goes to fund the war, because they don't have that money. There's not enough. There would never be enough based on the amount of taxes we pay. It's the money that gets printed to fund war leads to huge inflation. You know, wars are inflationary, and so, of course, we all suffer then because of the increase in the cost of living and so on. I just thought I'd...
A good deal of it is debt right now, especially with, you know, these huge appropriations for Afghanistan and Iraq. You know, $180 billion a year on top of, you know, the $500 billion that is the regular standing army cost. So yeah, I mean, a good bit of that is borrowed money.
Right. Well, you know, to get back on the topic, you know, that we were talking about originally, you know, just as regards to the way the media, you know, affects things, I think the reason I was bringing up the issues about recruitment is mostly just a lot of the dishonest practices that go into that, you know, and in some cases, like we were talking about earlier, you know, you said, like, in your film, Top Gun was, like, considered to be, like, one of the most valuable recruitment films ever, and that actually brought up one of my other points that I brought up to you also off the air was when we talked about, like, what happened with the film Independence Day. You know, like, because they looked at it, it was a very patriotic looking film. The military showed a lot of interest in helping them, and they basically, because Area 51 was in the script, they pulled back their, you know, assistance and said, well, we're not going to help you any further. You can keep the footage that we gave you unless you're going to take Area 51 out of the film. James Cameron obviously refused to do that, but I'm not bringing that up really to talk about Area 51 in so much as just the fact that there is a significant amount of assistance you get from the military if you're willing to feature them. And I think that's definitely what was going on with the new Transformers films, because in some cases you see more of the military than you do of the robots. You know, and you see also the military doing things that traditionally in Transformers they were never able to do. I mean, in the cartoon, you know, they would constantly try to assist and try to fight the Decepticons, and they would fail miserably. And instead, you've got these, you know, Marines going at it, you know, with the Decepticons with actually a chance of winning. And I'm just, which, doesn't necessarily bother me in of itself, but, a lot of my friends have told me that they actually, even ones who are not politically active, are like, man, this thing is like a frickin' commercial for the military, because they're in every other scene, and, they're showing off all these, all this equipment, and, some of the main characters actually turn into the equipment, and I don't think people realize, that, the military is well aware of the recruitment aspect of this, and that's why you see all this stuff in these films, and the reason that they're willing to help. And I think a large part of that is because of the fact that we don't have a draft, we don't have any form of conscription. So, they resort to this, or resort to this because that's what they feel they have to do, I suppose. Between that and just recruiting, people like Blackwater, supposedly, Blackwater is also a solution to the, well, we don't have to conscript people, so we'll just hire companies like Blackwater. Did you have any comment on that?
Well, of all the things that I've, blathered on about in this interview, this is the thing that I think is probably the most useful piece of information that I think everyone ought to be aware of in terms of the relationship between the military and Hollywood and also other entertainment industries, and that is that there is an office set up to make these transactions. It's called the Hollywood Liaison Office. It's in the Pentagon. It's a public relations entity headed by a man named Phil Strub. There's a wonderful book that came out, now it's about 7 years ago, by David Robb, called Operation Hollywood. And he's really he's a journalist, probably the first person to really take a good look at this relationship. And he basically goes through the documents, digs them up, and they haven't been previously looked at in depth. But the relationship pretty much goes like this. If you want to make a war movie and you're a producer, or you're at a production house, you can't get your hands on an aircraft carrier, an F-14 Tomcat, or you can't get your hands on newsreel footage and the proper uniforms and even the kinds of intelligence for designing military hardware. And the only place you can't go to the surplus store. You got to go to the Hollywood Liaison Office and pitch your movie to Phil Strub, who looks at your script and either gives it a thumbs up or a thumbs down and says, okay, we'll give you an aircraft carrier. It costs $1 million a day to run. We'll give it to you for a week if you give us script oversight rights and doctoring rights. So take a look at the script and change what they want to change. And it could be historical changes. It could be technical changes. But we're going to make the script into something that the Pentagon can approve. And you see, this relationship working out very well in terms of films like Top Gun, Behind Enemy Lines, Pearl Harbor, Transformers 1 and 2, all of the upcoming Iron Man. I don't know how many there are going to be, but all the upcoming Iron Man movies are kind of encrusted with military hardware. And, these films are doing well not only because they're blockbusters and very appealing, but they're doing well because they're keeping their bottom line and they're keeping their overhead very low, because essentially these films are being subsidized heavily with set features and intelligence and all kinds of advice by the military and by the taxpayer. So when a producer wants to write a film, they're more than likely, it's going to be a war film of any kind, or even just Transformers, they're more than likely to say, well, what's the bang for the buck that we can get here? And can we include military elements? Because, explosions in F-14s are fun to look at. And it essentially has a chilling effect for those who do not want to make a film in the way that mimics a recruiting poster. And it really gives a real leg up to people like Jerry Bruckheimer and Michael Bay and the people that have historically been in bed with the Hollywood Liaison Office and Phil Strub. So you have this kind of tilting of the field of representation where, the image of war that we get is tilted by this money in favor of Pentagon types of representations. And this is a transaction that goes on behind the scenes. Producers aren't like getting on Entertainment Tonight and talking about it. Directors aren't, and the Hollywood Liaison Office is not talking about it publicly usually, only when they have to defend it. So the only way that you know as a consumer of war films is you have to wait to the end of the credits, the very end, and you'll probably see something like this film was made in concert and with the generous help of the Air Force.
Right.
But we see this kind of relationship replicated across not only Hollywood film, but almost every entertainment medium, including sports and toys, reality television, cop shows, even anything that represents the CIA, and now even corporations are getting in on the act and thinking, if Hollywood can do this and pull it off so well, why can't GE?
Right.
So it's a form of product placement, if you will, but the product is the military. The product is a version of history that not only helps with future recruiting, but also gives the public a version of history that is perhaps more likely to result in voting patterns that authorize huge expenditures on weapon systems, etc.
And it's interesting is that every now and then a film will come through and I'm like surprised that it got through. But did you watch The Green Zone, for example?
Yeah.
I was really surprised by that film. I'm sitting in the theater going, wow, I can't believe this. This is like a big tent film, and it's totally like, it was like a dramatization of No End in Sight, the documentary No End in Sight. I just was astonished that they just did a movie that was about, basically was about, yeah, we were wrong in Iraq. It just blew me away.
Yeah, it's interesting to watch that evolution, because the kinds of things that the Hollywood Liaison Office is authorizing, like a film like Black Hawk Down, is not the kind of thing that they would have authorized in the 1980s. And so the story is changing. The story that is being authorized is changing. It's allowing more of a sort of a personalized story of the embattled soldier who maybe doesn't know what he is doing and is really having a tough time and watching his buddies get blown away. And so I think there's a recognition on the part of the liaison office that people aren't going to swallow Top Gun anymore.
Right.
They're going to have, there's got to be a critical edge, and walking that line, I'm sure, is a difficult thing, but you can kind of trace the narrative as it changes, and it seems to me, this is the kind of thing that I'm studying as a person who looks at rhetoric and the military. The narrative of the story, the official story, is changing toward one that personalizes the event of war, so takes it out of the political realm and personalizes it and puts it on the back of the embattled soldier. It's a character that we both want to be, in a sense. It's a heroic character, but it's also one that we feel sorry for,
right.
in a sense. So it's a support the troops kind of narrative, a sort of POW, MIA kind of narrative that maintains a certain amount of credibility because it shows the horrors of war, but at the same time generates enormous pathos for the individual soldier while avoiding at all costs the political ramifications of the decision to go to war. I think this is the developing narrative, but I could be wrong about this.
Well, it also made me wonder if maybe there's some because there seems to be an activist element that's developing in Hollywood. There's like, for every film that it's almost as though, people who think outside the box, like the Wachowski brothers in particular, putting out films like The Matrix and more specifically V for Vendetta, which is probably one of the most responsible films for the reason that I'm even doing what I'm doing in political activism. Was one of the films that inspired me to think about it. And then I know that they point blank, they asked Lucas if he was trying to make some kind of show of like a dichotomy as far as like comparing what was going on in the Bush administration with the evil emperor in his in his new episode 1 through 3 Star Wars movies. it makes me wonder if there's some element there that's kind of, acting out. Like, for example, as much as people pick on Matt Damon, I've heard him say some stuff that I tend to agree with that was kind of outside of that. And you do get a lot of, like you put up, war protesters in Hollywood, the different actors and stuff that they go after, people like Charlie Sheen, or not Charlie Sheen as much as Martin Sheen, but, like Martin Sheen actually, he narrated a great film about Vietnam called American Apocalypse. That film just floored me. I don't even think of Vietnam anywhere near the way I used to, and after I watched that documentary, and you can see that for free on Google as well. But that's I guess what I was wondering is if you felt maybe that there was some kind of partisanship going on. Maybe some people are thinking they can make a difference with their films. I mean, I went into the Green Zone expecting to watch a typical rah-rah military movie, and when I came away from it, it was kind of like, I don't want to say I was let down in any fashion, but it was definitely not what I expected. I walked away from it, as I said earlier, stunned, rather than going, oh, that was a good movie. But whereas Black Hawk Down, I think, it really emphasized the brotherhood aspect in a way that made being a soldier sound appealing. But overall, though, I'd say, particularly in the news, you do get exposed to, like, I was looking at the stuff you're talking about the soundtracks, the way they present everything, and the dramatizations and the video simulations, and, like, it reminded me of that, actually. I used to watch the show Airwolf when I was a kid, and, how they'd have those animated, like, well, this is the plane we're fighting, it would show, like, all the specs and all that, and that's what, CNN was doing that for the longest time. And you have some of those video clips in Militainment, where they're bringing up, it's this kind of missile, it has these specifications, and, it is like they are characters in a movie. So, Chibi, did you have anything to add?
Well, I didn't know that, although what Roger was saying about basically subsidizing, cutting off the top for directors and whatnot, it makes a lot of sense. I don't know why I never thought of that before. So it's interesting to learn that. That's a really strong way of upholding status quo, the way people view war and whatnot. And it makes it really hard, on the other hand, for some other director to come along and make a movie that depicts history a little more realistically or whatever, because that means they're going to have to dig it out of their pocket, which is, rarely going to happen. And so, you're right. I think that's the most interesting thing out of this interview, that I feel like I've learned something from that.
Well, good. In the words of South Park, I've learned something today.
Right.
At least one thing.
Well, just the reason that I bring Chibi on is because he watches this stuff as much as I do, so don't take that as an indication that the conversation wasn't interesting. It's just he and I basically spent hours and hours talking about this stuff, so... but that's why, it's like I said, he was one of the people who recommended your film to me, if I remember correctly, and, so overall, it's been awesome having you on the show, and I hope in the future, if you ever want to be a consultant on this subject, I'd be happy to bring you onto another show if this subject comes up again. We're down to 6 minutes left in the show. Again, everybody, visit v-radio.org. That's vradio.org with a minus sign between V and radio. I am looking for donations to get through the rest of the month, and you guys have been great so far with your support. And basically now, I guess, if there are any questions, I haven't really gotten any in the chat room, which is unusual. If anybody had anything they wanted to point out, but looking at this over, no, nothing really sticking out, but see, private military firms are certainly more viable than standing national militaries, although the impact of corruption is quite high. Not sure what the point he was trying to get at, but in any case, thank you for doing the film that you did. And I mean, can I ask you, like, what experience prompted you to do it? What experience prompted you to write that book?
Well, I was studying other things. I was doing my PhD, and so I was studying other things. But then, was so compelled by this abrupt change in the political mood after 9/11, and then watching this really astonishing machine go into motion before the 2003 invasion of Iraq, and kind of noticing that, I was a sophomore in high school or something like that when we invaded Iraq the first time in 1991. But noticing that, things had moved in a decidedly entertaining direction, I guess.
Right.
And the image that really, I guess, hooked me was, I was watching news coverage, and in between the news segments, they would show an advertisement for a game called Conflict Desert Storm, which, this ad culminates in a crosshairs shot of this mustached face Saddam Hussein type character. and so this rhythm of like, here we go, are we going to war in 2 weeks, and these advertisements just got me thinking on this subject. And I didn't have a TV at the time.
Right.
So I had a friend of mine. I gave him a ton of VHS tapes and had him, just tape hours and hours, and just started on this track and was doing a lot of like anti-war organizing at Penn State, and it's just astonishing and absurd at the same time. And was really it really compelled me into both activism and also teasing out the symbolic components of all of this, because evaluation aside, it's an astonishing machine. Not only the equipment that has to roll into a country halfway around the world to prosecute a war, but this amazing sudden crystallization of these media outlets. Suddenly they're talking the same language. They have the same banners. They're telling the same stories. They're even synced into the same kind of time rhythms. And I was just so astonished by that. And I can't say from personal experience that this was similar things were going on during the first Gulf War. But scholars and other people have hinted at some of the same types of machinations, but I think they really kicked it into gear. So on just a purely technical level, I just thought it was the most interesting thing going. And of course, it's got this tremendously important moral dimension to it as well. So I switched gears and I started to really dive into the literature, and it was to me like a rabbit hole that had no end, and really touched every aspect of our social and political lives in really profound ways. And I have been kind of studying and been very interested in the subject ever since. And I thought I'd make a film that really displayed the most fascinating aspects of it.
Let me interrupt you just briefly to tell the live listeners, the live portion of the show is getting ready to end in about 90 seconds. You can catch the rest of the conversation on archive. There's just a couple more questions I wanted to ask you, Roger, that I had forgotten to ask earlier, that are
okay.
And also to future shows. But thank you for tuning in to V Radio. As I said, you can hear the rest of the conversation on archive. Thanks again, and be sure to check out vradio.org, v-radio.org. And go ahead and continue with what you were saying, Roger.
I think I was done, actually.
Oh, okay.
So go
Well,
ahead.
the next question I wanted to ask you, and this actually is pertinent because I also got a hold of the filmmaker who made the movie Iran Is Not the Problem. Have you watched that film?
No, I haven't even heard of it.
Oh, wow, yeah. You'd really like it because they point out a lot of the same things that you're talking about that went into the Iraq War are basically going on with Iran. I wanted to ask you, what you thought about that, if you've noticed that pattern. I had actually recognized it also because I watched C-SPAN, and I was watching how virtually all the same things that Ron Paul and Dennis Kucinich have been complaining about from the beginning, the things that go into trying to convince people to go to war, that we did in Iraq, are happening again with respect to Iran. I mean, have you noticed the posturing? I mean, I haven't watched as much news as I did last time, but have you noticed the posturing to try to get us to go into Iran?
Yeah, I think the similar kinds of tools and strategies are being used, but the political landscape is vastly different. Just economically, we're still in a recession, and people have sort of bigger problems than considering Iran's potential nuclear capabilities. And we are seeing lots of soldiers come home with severe problems, and even on, and this has been kind of a consideration for the past 6 years or so, even on a military level, we have presence in Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Iraq, and we're pretty much stretched thin. So even on a technical military level, strategically, it would be very difficult to wage the same kind of war. But I think, on a social level, they are kind of stoking the flames in typical ways. So there's of course the fear appeal, but there's also humanitarian appeal, which has been the intense focus on kind of late Eastern Bloc style protests against what of course admittedly is a dictatorial government. But there are all kinds of dictatorial governments. There are all kinds of mass protests. This is a cyclical thing. I mean, these are happening in many of the countries that we describe as our allies and we support financially. But the intense focus on Iran and its human rights situation, the way that the Islamist government treats women, etc. These are features that are not unique to Iran, but are unique in the sense that we've surrounded them militarily with bases on both sides, and we are preparing the population who is reticent at this point. When I say we, the government and powers that be, are preparing the population for some kind of future military adventure, at least sanctions, probably long-term economic pressures, and then some sort of covert operations, which have been going on since Seymour Hersh wrote in the New Yorker about them in 2006, 2005. Sort of these off-the-record kinds of military ventures are going to be consistently putting the pressure on Iran and trying to, transform that region to something that looks like a pre-Iranian revolution, something that's a lot more copacetic with our energy interests there. So yeah.
Well, that's, and it actually kind of, sometimes it occurs to me that they take a while to get around to capitalizing on the things that we're talking about. But when you talk about like human rights violations and all that, that actually reminds me of the fact that, I was remembering during the Ron Paul campaign, because Hannity, who's probably one of my favorite journalists to hate, is going after Ron Paul. He's like, you don't like it, he's like, you're saying it's okay that he gassed the Kurds, he gassed his own people. I don't like that. I think it's immoral, and, Ron Paul points out, he's like, that was like back in the 80s. We didn't do anything about it then. We gave him the gas that he used to gas those people. It's like, he was trying to point out that, because people have tried to do that too. They're like, well, we got to get rid of this Saddam guy because of all these terrible atrocities he's done, like 10 years ago, which we didn't care about until the oil question was brought in. That's an example of, I think the media gets prepared to lay the foundations. I imagine we'll be saying the same thing in the event that we did invade Iran, down the road. They're terrible to their women. There are all these, various things that have went on. And as you pointed out, that it's not unique to Iran is actually a very excellent point. because there's stuff like that going on all over the world, and we don't seem to care about it unless there's some kind of monetary interest involved. You know, I mean, it's like we spend all of this time over there in Iraq and supposedly in Afghanistan to overthrow these terrible governments, but we keep dragging our feet about a situation like Darfur, which obviously needs our help. But there's no money in Darfur. It's just a big dry desert. There's nothing there. So therefore, we don't seem to care about the human rights violations in those countries. And it's interesting to me, and that's one of the reasons why, you know, my political radar went off, so to speak, just from the things that, you know, my mentor Mike Gravel taught me about this sort of thing, is that you tend to hear the rumblings of it, you know, well in advance. It's actually what got him back into politics. He was one of the guys who got rid of the draft, and he points out that he's glad that he did now because, you know, that's pretty much what it would require to invade Iran. You're correct about that. We could not do it with the amount of people we have right now. It would require either a draft or that we just abandon the theater in Iraq, which I don't think would be strategically sound, or in Afghanistan. But it definitely feels to me anyway, because, you know, that they're trying to prepare us mentally for the possibility that they may have to do it. I mean, another option is they may just be doing this to scare Iran. Maybe they're hoping that Iran will, you know, pop back into place. You know, but when you take into account those, like the axis of evil speech that included Iran and and North Korea, pardon, but you know, it makes you wonder if that's on the drawing board, so to speak, or on the table for future endeavors. But you know, go ahead.
Oh, I was going to comment that yeah, it's definitely on the drawing board, and you know, they're definitely throwing the dice in that direction of the map.
Right.
The problem for strategic planners, influence planners in that area of the world, is that they need to move in before Iran acquires a nuclear weapon, and they might.
Right.
But once they have a nuclear weapon, they have, you know, essentially veto power over potential invasion. And so that's the problem. The problem isn't the nuclear weapon itself, or that it may be used, you know, dangerously or something like that. The problem is that we will not be able to move in to Iran and occupy it in the same way that we have done with Afghanistan and Iraq.
So one more situations like Pakistan, basically.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Pakistan is a complex situation, but yeah, I mean, as long as the government in Iran holds and they have a nuclear weapon, then that's veto power.
Basically, have to put up with them forever at that point. And I think it's probably why North Korea was trying to cruise for one or make it look like maybe they have one. And it's interesting, you know, that I guess it's just, you know, I remember how these things get spun, and, you know, Iran is Not the Problem was a very good film. As I said, I got a hold of their filmmaker, and they went basically in the same direction of pointing out the media seems to be moving in a direction to convince the American people that we need to invade Iran. You know, I know other things that they've talked about. You know, Mike Gravel thought for the longest time, you know, he's like, when they say things like there's nothing off the table with respect to Iran, he felt that meant a nuclear strike. You know, that we could, in theory, you know, use tactical nuclear weapons on them, or even that we'll hint at it, maybe we'll saber rattle with it. But, you know, it just, I don't know, I generally think that, you know, as you said, the machine, so to speak, if they're pushing on something, it probably means they have something in mind. But anyway, see, that was, you know, that was the first question. I know I had another one. I'm going to see if I can try to remember it. In the meantime, I'll ask Chibi. You know, hey, Chibi, do you have any comment on anything else we've said so far?
My mind is kind of going elsewhere with that. I mean, not elsewhere, but I'm thinking about everything you guys are saying, and I was just kind of thinking about the whole Euro switch for oil trade in Iran and North Korea and Iraq, and I don't know. No, I don't guess I have anything to add. I'm just sort of pondering these issues to myself.
No, it's funny that you bring that up, actually. In another brief documentary called Iraq Conspiracy, they talked about the fact that it was likely that we invaded Iraq. It was actually a film made by British people, but we invaded Iraq because Saddam Hussein was like, well, I can't defeat you militarily, but I could switch to the euro to sell my oil. And
right. I think that is a reason, not the reason, but I think that is a reason, and I think it's very relevant with Iran as well. I mean, they still have decent amount of oil reserves. That could be a reason as well, that, you know, if we can control that oil. But I don't think we'd have a need to go that far if they weren't threatening to dump the U.S. dollar, which the more countries that do that, if OPEC, I mean, well, anyways, yeah, you already know the story.
Right, for sure. Did you have any comment on that before I asked the question that I just remembered?
Well, the competitors for our oil in Iran and also, you know, in Africa are China and Russia. You mentioned Darfur before. I think one of the reasons that we do know about Darfur is because someone else is perpetuating that atrocity. This is Chinese and Russian influence in that area to clear the land to prospect for oil. Mm-hmm. You know, this is one of the reasons why it hasn't been used to demonize those countries, but it's one of the reasons why it's on the news. I don't think that it would be as much of a news item had, you know, these sorts of genocidal activities been precipitated by U.S. influence instead.
I see what you mean. I don't think it's on the news as much as it should be. Go ahead, Judy.
I just said certainly not.
Yeah. Now, are you a teacher, or were you just getting your PhD together?
I got my PhD in 2004, 2005. Something like that. But yeah, at the time I was writing the book and also putting together the movie. I was working on a PhD, but for the last 6 years I've been a professor here at the University of Georgia.
Yeah, that's what I remembered. I was curious if any of this has impacted you as a teacher. Like, have you shared any of this with your students? They know about your book.
Yeah, I teach a class called Rhetoric and Popular Culture, where one of the weeks we focus on violence and military political issues and how that is reflected in popular culture. And I teach some special topics classes in media and war, both on the undergraduate and graduate level. So yeah, it's definitely sort of filtering into the classroom. And I've found that student responses to some of this material have, you know, really changed with the political zeitgeist, if you will.
We like that word around here.
Over the past, 10 years or so that I've been addressing the issue in the classroom.
Well, that's actually great that we have a teacher in a position to do that. There's actually something I was learning from a member of the Green Party who's in my local Zeitgeist chapter, is he said that the Republicans got people involved in education to start to switch people over to their methods of thinking. And it occurred to me there's just so many people that it's like I already look at this now. It's like I remember when I came out of school thinking, and I didn't go to college, but I look at my own children and how I would educate them, and I have a feeling that, you know, once they get to be a teenager, you know, they're going to be seeing films like Militainment, you know, films that really get you thinking, and then I wonder, you know, what kind of childhood they're going to have, though, because they're going to be surrounded by people who still believe all that stuff, like, is real. I imagine it's got to be difficult. I mean, do you ever get any, I mean, because, like, you're really touching on some stuff that I think some people are really emotionally attached to. You get any hate mail or any maltreatment for you exposing these things that people almost feel religiously about?
Well, no, I haven't. I don't get hate mail. And I think, you know, by the time the students go through an entire semester where they're exposed to the foundations for some of these critiques and don't have, there's not the opportunity to disengage and have just a knee-jerk reaction, but having to think issues through, then, you know, they are, you know, weighing these debates in sophisticated ways and not just knee-jerk ways. So, no, I think the, you know, even though some of the students may grumble about me behind my back or, you know, somewhere else with each other, the response is largely a respectful one, and I try to keep a respectful classroom and try to keep common values in perspective. And my goal, and hopefully this film doesn't do this, or the book, but my goal is not to make people cynical about their government as an external entity that manipulates us, but to try to clue us in on the power that we have as citizens to be the government, and to enact the kind of political change that we would like to see. So that's my worst fear, is that this breeds cynicism, this breeds not systemic thinking, but conspiracy type thinking, or cynical ideas about our relationship to our government. But I think we have a system that, to some degree, we can work in as democratic entities, and that we should value that and try to cultivate that rather than drop out. Yeah.
Well, that's actually great. I was just curious. I mean, I had thought about becoming a teacher myself for that very reason, but I'd be worried that something might be deemed to be too controversial, and they won't let you teach it. I learned a little bit about, there was a film called Higher Learning, or something like that. Declining by Degrees, actually was what it was called, Higher Education at Risk, where they talk about how they don't pay professors for being good teachers. They pay you for research papers or other things that you can add to the bio of the university you're working for, and that you're actually told that if you fail too many people, it can endanger your job. Have you ever experienced any of that?
Well, there's definitely pressures. Usually goes by the name of the corporatization of the university, where grant money from external funding agencies, sometimes government, but most often corporate entities, are driving education. So the humanities are being turned into a wing of advertising and public relations, and they're shrinking in spades, and the rest of the university is being either turned into a technical school or a research entity that is an arm of some sort of external corporate entity. So yeah, I see that. I see the disappearance of the humanities as we once knew them, and there's still a measure of freedom to teach these sorts of classes, which have no immediate tech school applicability, but they teach us how to be good citizens. And the University of Georgia is a land-grant state education institution, and one of its missions is to teach people how to be good citizens. And hopefully I'm sort of enacting that by asking people to think critically about the media's relationship with the military and our place in that dynamic.
Well, that was pretty much all I had. Chibi, do you have any closing thoughts before I give the floor to Roger for any closing thoughts he has?
No, I'd just like to say I appreciated the interview. It's a great listen. I know I didn't participate a whole lot, but...
It's good to have you on board.
Yeah.
Well, Roger, I wanted to ask you as a closing question, is there anything for the future? Are we ever looking at a sequel or any other films or books you might be writing that you want to tell people about?
Well, I'm working on a number of articles right now that probably won't be of interest to your audience, but I'm continuing to write about war and mostly Hollywood film, and as we discussed earlier, the developing narrative that is coming out of official channels and quasi-official channels, which I think is an interesting one. You mentioned how activists and resistance, rebellion is being portrayed, and I would argue probably commodified to some degree, so that it becomes, just like war, a kind of entity for consumption that has been kind of castrated and denuded and turned into a sideshow. But those things are still up for debate. But yeah, I have nothing else to plug. If that's your question.
Well, just also if there was anything else you were going to be doing in the future, just as a filmmaker or whatever.
Well, I am working on one film right now that looks at resistance practices within militainment culture. 3 artists and activists that we could get into this would be a long story. Artists and activists that are going into games or playing with the internal dynamics of war-themed video games and doing very interesting things on that level. It's going to be called Returning Fire, and it's a shorter film that appears in 3 vignettes, but I think it's still very interesting.
That sounds great. Definitely let me know when you're ready to premiere that. I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah, I'll send you a copy.
Excellent. Yeah, I'm actually meaning to get a DVD copy of your film too. I just haven't. The finances around here have been very tight. I'm going through a bit of problems at home, divorce and things like that have really, hit me. But in any case, I really appreciated your film, and it's I added that to my list of other films that have kind of helped to wake me up in that regard. And I really it's an argument that I get into sometimes with my libertarian friends, as I used to be involved in that group, and they think everything should be privatized, and I just kind of get to a point where it's like, when they're scared of the stuff that Orwell was talking about in 1984, they think that they're talking about socialism and that system. But I'm almost more afraid of an independent media that is motivated by the amount of profit that it can make by getting into bed with big corporations. I think that we're looking at a stage where the journalistic integrity is no longer in any way a requirement. And it makes me, whereas I don't think it should be state regulated, it almost makes me think that we should go back to, because like one of the things they deregulated when they deregulated the media, and they talked about this in Orwell Rolls in Its Grave, was that they deregulated how much one person could own of it. We used to have rules about how much, how many TV stations you were allowed to own, how many radio stations you were allowed to own, so that you couldn't get away with doing something like what we have now, where basically now Rupert Murdoch arguably has more control over who becomes president than any American citizen. And if I remember right, he's not even an American citizen, just through controlling what you hear, what you see, and yeah, technically people could, just go outside of that and learn what's going on, but it just, in the same way that, Orwell pointed out in 1984, it's, you're fed this truth, and you just kind of go along with it, and especially if you have society agreeing and believing that that it works, then they're going to continue to eat the spoon-fed crap, and I don't really know what the solution is as long as we're in a monetary system. As long as we look at things like the truth as a commodity that could be bought and sold and modified for profit, I don't know that we'll ever be in a position that we can really trust the media. Do you have any closing thoughts about that?
Well, you're right that there's been a tremendous consolidation of huge media companies, and that other smaller entities are dying off. Especially, we're seeing that right now with newspapers. Newspapers that are providing any kind of independent journalism, and even the bigger newspapers, are going under right now, and there doesn't seem to be anything filling their place. Prospects look bleak for independent journalism in the future of any sort. But I would urge listeners, and also if you get a chance, to check out a video. This was an appearance on Now with Bill Moyers on PBS by a couple of scholars, of media scholars, Robert McChesney and John Nichols. And they talk about a proposal that they have for enlivening independent journalism that relies on a voucher system. It's not state-run media, and it's not corporatized media. It's this third way, which is kind of absurd on its surface, but they make a really compelling argument for this sort of voucher system that they advocate. So I would urge listeners to check that out. Robert McChesney, John Nichols on Bill Moyers Now.
That's awesome. Yeah, I'll have to check that out myself. I have to thank you once again for being willing to come on my show. I mean, although I do have above average listenership for, a blog talk radio show, it helps when people who are in positions like you, do activist stuff like you do, help to support, programs like mine as well, because, that allows people to really make that choice for independent media. It's like, I deal with this sometimes. They're, running to different activist groups. They aren't necessarily interested in going on anything that isn't mainstream media, and then they complain about the mainstream media. It's like, well, it's never going to get any better. If people always have to go on Fox News to even hear from you, then the independent media that actually cares about what you're doing is never going to ever get any stronger. But in any case, this has been a great show, and I really thank you for coming on. And I hope you'll check out Iran Is Not the Problem. I'm really curious about somebody with your background taking a look at that, and you can watch that for free on the internet, I'm pretty sure. And it's a very good film that talks about how that focuses in that direction. I will have that filmmaker on my radio show apparently sometime after the 22nd. They will be available. And thanks again for everybody tuning in, and thanks everybody for supporting V Radio. You guys are the reasons I do this, and thanks for coming on.
Thank you, Neil.
Say goodbye. Okay, say goodnight, Chibi.
Good night.
Good night, Chibi.
I'll talk to you guys later. Thanks again, and I'm going to leave you guys with some words from Roxanne Meadows and Jock Fresco.
This is Roxanne Meadows.
And this is Jock Fresco.
And you're listening to V Radio.